October 27, 1962 is known as Black Saturday, and the reason is that it was the closest the world came to the brink of entering World War III, a comprehensive nuclear war that would destroy the entire world. The parties, as usual, were America and the Soviet Union. On that day, literally, between them and the war was one man, a Soviet officer named Vasily Ark. Officer above this was on board a Soviet submarine carrying a nuclear torpedo with a destructive power as strong as the Hiroshima bomb. The captain of the submarine was determined to launch a nuclear torpedo on America, which was certain to start a nuclear war between the two sides. Nothing was stopping the captain had it not been for the fate of your lord that it was Officer Vasily. Arkhipov was present on board the submarine by pure coincidence. So how exactly did the officer save the situation? How exactly did the situation reach the point where the captain of a Soviet submarine was ready to launch a nuclear torpedo at America? In this video, we will talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is considered the most dangerous crisis that this planet has ever experienced. The end of World War II and this situation of the submarine was only one of the many situations that occurred during this crisis. Situations that each one of them could have started a nuclear war had it not been for the karma. Before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Your support means a lot to me, and it helps me to keep creating great content for you. Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the crisis that we will talk about in this video. This time, the person who saves the world is a Soviet officer. But before we get into the details of this event, let us know how the situation reached this degree of tension between America and the Soviet Union in the first place. I think you have understood what it is the Cold War because we talked about it more than once before. But as a reminder, the Cold War was a period of tension and a race for progress between America and the Soviet Union that began in the year 1947, approximately at the end of World War II, and continued until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the year 1991. Throughout these years, there was great hostility between America and the Soviet Union, and each one was trying to get ahead of the other, especially on the military side. One of the important steps that America took was the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and one of the first countries to enter NATO was Turkey. Turkey became the closest ally to America from the borders of the Soviet Union, literally at their doorstep. In the year 1959, America transferred a group of nuclear missiles to Turkey. Of course, the missiles remained under the control of the Americans, not under the control of the Turks. So America could bomb Moscow or any vital city in the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons in less than a quarter of an hour. But they literally put their missiles in the closest place they could put them, of course. America's justification for this movement was that it was a defensive movement to protect their European allies, the Soviet Union. They frowned upon this thing, of course, and considered it an escalation, and they were finding a way to respond to them, and now Cuba is on. Cuba is a country in South America, and one of the closest countries to America, and at that time, Cuba was experiencing a military revolution, a revolution that has continued. 6 years ago, this revolution was led by a man named Fidel Castro, and one of its major symbols after his friend Guevara. This group was of Marxist communist thought, and of course the leaders of communist thought in the world, the growth of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union's relationship with the Cuban revolutionaries was fat on the honey of the Soviet Union. It was one of the largest, supporters of them, and finally, after 6 years of this third, in the year 1959, the same year in which America landed nuclear missiles in Turkey, the Cuban Revolution overthrew the regime in Cuba, and Fidel Castro, the leader of the revolution and an ally of the Soviet Union, became the president of Cuba, one of the countries closest to America. At that time, the Soviet Union became they have an ally at the door of the Americans, just as Turkey was an ally of America. By the nature of the Cuban Revolution, this is America and Cuba were friends. And even many rich Americans used to go in summer in Cuba, and the Cuban economy was closely linked to America. All of this changed after the Cuban Revolution and after Castro took power. So he severed relations with America. And all the banks, factories, and institutions that were under the management of the Americans were taken and turned into national institutions. And what is worse than all of this for the Americans, of course, is that those who broke his group were communists loyal to the Soviet Union, the first enemy of America. America and its leadership wanted to overthrow Castro by any means and tried to carry out several operations to assassinate him. But all of them failed, and in the year 1961, they coordinated and financed a major attack on Cuba. This attack was carried out by the American forces, not those who carried it out. They were Cuban soldiers and military officers hostile to Castro and his group. These soldiers were recruited from Cuba after the revolution succeeded. This means that America adopted the exiled soldiers and supported them financially and tactically. But the attack failed and most of the attackers were killed or captured. Of course, these attempts forced Castro to turn to the Soviet Union, and the relationship between the two leaders became very strong. Once the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, said about Castro, he considered Castro like his son. The Soviet Union began. He supplies Cuba with everything it needs, from supplies to weapons. Soviet ships were coming from Cuba non-stop, and Soviet military bases were established inside Cuban territory. These bases were full of Soviet soldiers, officers, and technicians. This matter, of course, made the Americans nervous and made their anxiety increase. Castro was afraid that the American leadership was counting on preparation for the invasion of Cuba. And from here, there was an agreement between the Soviet leadership and the Cuban leadership to transfer several nuclear missiles to Cuba. This means that the Soviets will respond to the movement of the Americans and Turkish missiles, and they will then have nuclear missiles at America's door. Of course, this process of transferring the missiles must be done secretly because the Americans and their planes' espionage did not detect them. So imagine that they transported them on cargo ships. They did not transport them on military ships. No nuclear missiles on cargo ships. They hid them in the heart of the ships. They did not leave them on land. Of course, these missiles were accompanied by Soviet soldiers, and they were even wearing civilian clothes so that no one would suspect them. For the American spy planes, imagine them and even the soldiers you see, when they embarked on this mission from Russia or the Soviet Union, they did not know that they were going to Cuba. To such an extent, the mission was secret. They did not know until after they had finished, when they left the port and were halfway there, or after they had covered a distance, then a ship had passed. Behind a ship, the Soviet forces transported dozens of short and medium-range nuclear missiles to Cuba. Each missile had such destructive capacity that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs turned out to be toys. Missiles could wipe out cities in the blink of an eye. Then the Soviets could launch them at the most important American cities within less than a quarter of an hour. Of course, the missiles were under their control. The Soviets and the Cubans did not have any authority or ability to launch them or use them, such as placing American missiles in Turkey. But keep in mind that these missiles were not yet ready to be launched. Soviet technicians had to collect their parts and prepare their platforms and launch bases. And this thing could take several weeks. So time passed and the Americans did not have knowledge of these missiles. But of course they had spy planes that always flew over Cuba and photographed. Of course, the capabilities of spying and photography at that time were not as developed as they are today. All they were able to capture from high altitudes was a group of pictures like these that you see in front of you, even though the pictures were not completely clear. Yes, but with their military experience, they were able to analyze and discover that those in the pictures are nuclear missiles located in Cuba. They knew the types of missiles and were able to analyze their shapes, lengths, and ranges. They knew that if they were launched from Cuba, they could reach any city in America within 13 minutes after this discovery. Alarm bells rang for the leadership. America, of course, at that time. The American president, John F. Kennedy, was one of the most famous American presidents. The news arrived. He ordered a meeting at the highest level, a meeting in which the closest advisors, along with the generals of the army and the leaders of the security and intelligence services, participated in this group. They called it XCOM. This was the first meeting of the XCOM group. During this crisis, they discussed among themselves the appropriate means of responding to the new escalation. Of course, they knew that the missiles would then be ready to be launched and were still being prepared. So the first option they discussed was an aerial bombardment on the missile sites and destroying them before they were ready. In addition to the bombing, American forces would invade Cuba and enter with their army and tanks, and his planes and everything. They have a complete invasion to make sure that all the missiles are destroyed. And one time they destroy the Castro regime and end his rule and control over Cuba. Of course, this option would be a dangerous escalation. The war on Cuba could make the Soviet Union respond with a violent reaction, especially since there were Soviet soldiers and forces present in Cuba. American President Kennedy was not encouraged to have the choice, but the army generals were trying to pressure him to take it, telling him that if we did not destroy these missiles now, before the Soviets were ready, they would have the ability to kill 80 million American citizens with one strike, without us being able to intercept the missiles or do anything. They would only have a chance to strike the first strike, but after that a Canadian was not willing to take this huge risk. If he invaded Cuba, the Soviet Union might declare war. Some advisors advised him to take the option of airstrikes on the missile sites and destroy them without pricking his fist. But after the problem there is that the Soviet Union, most likely he would want to destroy the American missiles in Turkey, and this could escalate into a war. A Canadian was hesitant, not knowing what the best option was. He did not want to take the option that would provoke the Soviet Union to the point that they would enter a war. And at the same time, he had to do something to deal with the new threat that appeared before him at the door of his house. After discussions and meetings that lasted for several days with XCOM, finally President Kennedy made a decision. And the decision was to create a maritime isolation zone around Cuba. The American naval fleet will intercept any ship or vehicle approaching Cuba and will search it. And if there are any weapons on board, the ship will be returned from where it did not come. We can almost call it a complete siege of Cuba from all sides, so that no additional weapons or missiles reach them. But they will allow ships carrying supplies, foodstuffs, or basics to pass after they've been inspected. And at the same time, they will threaten to invade Cuba or aerial bombardment of sites. If the Soviet Union decides to withdraw them of their own free will, the idea is that they will besiege Cuba and escalate their threatening rhetoric without attacking now. They will wait for the reaction of the Soviet Union. Indeed, on October 22, 1962, American President Kennedy appeared before the world in a direct speech on television and said these words. He said that they had obtained unfounded evidence, raised suspicions about the presence of nuclear missiles in Cuba, and said that they would isolate Cuba and intercept any ship that approached it and would search it. If this ship carried weapons, it would be returned. In the end, Kennedy concluded his speech by threatening the Soviet Union that if they did not withdraw the missiles, America would have the right to invade Cuba or implement aerial bombardment on missile sites, and he declared that the Soviet Union was responsible for any missiles or strikes launched from Cuba towards America. And if this happened, America would respond with a violent retaliatory strike.
Shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations.
Strike. Of course, the blockade that America imposed on Cuba was met with disapproval from Castro and his regime, and they considered it an attack on them, and Castro was convinced that this blockade and American invasion of their country followed. He was certain that they would carry out their threats of invasion. The Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba were about to be prepared for launch. So Castro went and wrote an urgent telegram to the last leader of the Soviet Union and told him that the Americans were going to invade Cuba and encouraged him to launch a preemptive strike and launch nuclear missiles at America first. Don't prepare, yes, Castro was ready to start a nuclear war so simply. He did not want the end of the world to happen during his reign, so let's see. In fact, he was relieved when he knew that America would not invade Cuba or destroy the missiles, because this would be an escalation and it would be harmful because he was responding to the escalation, the same thing as the Americans. The siege and isolation of Cuba is still considered an escalation, but not at the level of the invasion. There is still room for diplomacy and attempts to reach a settlement. Proud to see, at that time, he had to think about how to respond, how he would react to the American siege of Cuba, especially since there are currently Soviet ships on their way to Cuba, and some of them are about to be delivered to their ships. Weeks before the American blockade, should he let these ships continue and try to bypass the American blockade, thus risking confrontation and interception from the American ships and not stopping Hesvin and ordering it to return? Khrushchev has become a position similar to that of a Canadian who wants to take the option of what to board. But at the same time, there will be a strong response in the meantime. The people of America were terrified. They were afraid that war might start at any moment, especially after President Kennedy raised the nuclear alert state to the second level. The nuclear alert scale in America had 5 levels. The second level was an unprecedented level, meaning literally one level remained, and they reached a comprehensive nuclear war. The people went crazy. They were stricken with panic. The stock markets collapsed, and people went out in their thousands to markets and supermarkets and bought supplies and food as if they were on the verge of famine or the collapse of the world. They literally cleaned the shelves, and many of them even built shelters in their homes or dug underground cellars in order to get lost. The Americans imposed a naval blockade around Cuba. The blockade belt extended. Along the international waters around Cuba, American ships and aircraft were deployed in the region and were covering every spot. It was impossible for a ship to cross without them seeing it. At first, the official Soviet position on the blockade was a challenge. They described the American blockade as piracy and an assault on freedom of movement in international waters. Their intention was to challenge the blockade, and on the 25th in October 1962, there were 12 Soviet ships approaching the blockade line. These ships had been weeks away from leaving the Soviet Union, that is, before the Americans even discovered that there were missiles in Cuba. And before they ended this blockade, some of these ships were carrying additional weapons and missiles heading to Cuba. So this was the case. Alertness on both sides is at its highest levels. President Kennedy stressed that the naval forces destroyed the American forces and that they did not authorize the ships or their crews because this matter could lead to war. The mission of the fleet is to intercept and inspect the ships, and if they carry weapons on board, they will be returned. Kennedy continued to explain and confirm this matter to all admirals and commanders. The Navy was afraid that an individual action by a captain, commander, or even an officer could lead to escalation and a major problem, and then they would enter into a war with the Soviets. Everyone was on their nerves. The situation was getting more and more tense as the Soviet ships approached the blockade line, and the American fleet was watching them and waiting for their arrival to the line to intercept it. But suddenly, a few kilometers away from the blockade line, the Soviet ships stopped and most of them reversed direction and began to return. The news reached Kennedy along the phone, and the first time he heard it, he took a deep breath of relief. He was standing on his nerves from the tension, but it was clear the Soviets and the artichokes had decided not to escalate the situation, and the siege continued. How many days later, some ships crossed after being inspected by the American Navy, and it was confirmed that they did not carry any weapons on board, of course, despite the success of the blockade in fulfilling its mission, which is to prevent any additional weapons or missiles from reaching Cuba. But the American leadership after that had the biggest problem in front of it, which, these are the missiles that I want to be in Cuba, and a little more will be ready for launch. So it was the order of the Army generals that they were preparing the American forces for an invasion, and Cuba was not intended to invade. But he had to prepare for the invasion in case the situation reached the worst stage. The generals, of course, were still encouraging him to invade and telling him that it was him. The correct option is that they must destroy the missiles before they are ready. But Kennedy remained committed to his position. He knew that if they invaded Cuba, this thing would certainly start a nuclear world war. Oh, the Soviets and the generals, it was not as if they saw this thing, but they wanted to invade. In any case, the army had to be prepared for the worst cases, and every party was sitting. The Americans, the Soviets, and even the Cubans were preparing for war. Each side was preparing its forces, planes, and nuclear weapons. American nuclear bomb carriers were literally flying around the Soviet Union, ready to penetrate their airspace and drop these nuclear bombs on their most important cities within less than a quarter of an hour. Without nuclear weapons, the American forces began their preparations. Especially in the states of Florida, which is the closest state to Cuba, were preparing themselves as if they were finally going to invade us. So they were supposed to begin an air bombardment with planes, and then a parachute landing of soldiers, accompanied by a naval landing of infantry and armored forces. So they prepared everything as if they were finally going to invade. And the generals and members of XCOM were still trying to convince Kennedy that the invasion would take place. Destroying the missiles was the right step. But Kennedy remained committed to his position until the last moment and tried to find a diplomatic solution before resorting to a military solution on the other side in Cuba. Castro was sitting second, trying to convince Khrushchev that he would launch a preemptive nuclear strike on America. He was convinced that America would then invade, and that attack is the best means of defense. He used to write telegrams to Khrushchev and try to convince him to strike America with a nuclear weapon. He wanted him to launch the first strike, but Khrushchev, as we said, had a Canadian-like stance. He did not want escalation and did not want a nuclear war. So he was trying to create a channel of diplomatic communication with the American leadership, but I stopped and saw he was still under pressure from Soviet leaders and generals. They were the same. They had a tendency similar to that of the American generals. Things would get worse on October 27, 1962. This date is known as Black Saturday, and more than one situation and more than one incident would occur that could have led the world toward war. The beginning of the nuclear program that day was, in fact, promising. The Shuf sent a peace proposal to the American leadership. The proposal was that the Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles and soldiers from Cuba in the event that America withdrew its missiles from Turkey and stopped its blockade of Cuba. They also made a pledge that it would not invade Cuba. When a Canadian saw the proposal, he was Adele made concessions and bargaining from both sides in a balanced manner. But the ExComm Council, his aides and the generals were against this proposal because they saw in it a weakness in their position, and the withdrawal of their missiles from Turkey would undermine their standing with their European allies and the Turkish leadership, who depend on them as a deterrent to the Soviet Union in the region. As a principle, he was convinced that America would they invaded it at any moment. So when they saw the plane sitting, they knew that it was a spy plane, and that it was sitting scouting their positions, most likely in preparation for an airstrike, so it was impossible for them to let it pass them by. So they fired more than one missile at it until they shot it down, and the American pilot was killed. Of course, shooting down an American plane and killing its pilot was considered an escalation and required a response. Here are the generals. They obtained a pressure card on Kennedy, and Canadian felt that he was cornered in a corner, and the ExComm Council was sitting and then demanding that they invade Cuba on Monday morning at the latest. Under these circumstances, President John Kennedy sat down, and his brother, Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General of the state, and they began to discuss the possibility of an amendment. The peace proposal that was presented to Khrushchev during this time and the tense events became the submarine event that we talk about at the beginning of the video. In order to understand what happened to the submarine, we must go back to the beginning of the events, when the Soviet Union began transferring missiles to Cuba a month before these events. The Soviet Union moved 4 giant submarines towards Cuba. The mission of these submarines was to support the Soviet and Cuban forces present there. Each of these 4 submarines carried a nuclear torpedo. Each torpedo was as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. It left Russia and took approximately 4 weeks to approach Cuba. But before it arrived, the American blockade was imposed on it. Cuba, in any case, these submarines move at a great depth under the sea. So discovery is very difficult, as they are submerged in the depth, meaning the sonar waves in the ships are difficult to reach the very deep layers. But these submarines were operated by engines that ran on diesel-electric power, and in order to charge the batteries, they needed to float to the surface of the sea. One of the 4 submarines was a submarine called the B-59, and they were close to the American naval blockade line. The charge rate on this submarine was low, reaching 20, as the energy was free. But the problem was that the American ships were almost caught, so they were able to track them even if they descended to the deepest depths, and what was worse for the submarine's crew was that they ran aground. Their batteries are sufficient for them, but for 6 hours the American ships and planes remained behind them, tracking them step by step. There is one more thing that we must mention, which is that the conditions of the crew on board the submarine were very bad. Temperatures in the submarine ranged between 45 and 65 degrees, depending on the depth they were in. So while they were in the depths of the sea were at their highest temperatures, they had already been suffering from these high temperatures for the past weeks, throughout the journey from Russia to Cuba. and they were hoping that they would relax a little when they reached Cuba and were able to rise up and smell the air. That the American blockade happened and now they were exposed and were forced to go down to the depths to try. They are escaping from the American Navy, and this thing has made the temperatures reach an unbearable level. Imagine that you are sitting inside a piece of iron with a temperature of 65 to 70 degrees. It is hell, by God, it is hell. The conditions of the crew inside the submarine were tragic, and on top of this, the American ships to track them were using sonar devices that can be directed at the submarine. These devices tracked the submarine, and at the same time, the crew was harmed by very annoying sounds. Sounds like hammering that shook the entire submarine and deafened their ears. And it was not a single ship that was releasing these waves. No, it was 5 warships sitting around hitting them with sonar. This was a tactic to make the submarine's crew more difficult due to the heat they were suffering from. Of course, the ship's goal. The American idea was that the submarine would come to the surface so that they could identify it and keep it away from the isolation area around Cuba. Their goal was not to engage it, nor could they have destroyed it in an instant if they wanted to. But this thing, of course, would lead to war, and it was completely against President Kennedy's instructions. The goal was only to harass the submarine so that it would emerge later. This chase continued for 2 hours. The American ships decided to drop bombs on the submarine called Death Tars. These are water bombs, but the bombs they dropped on the submarine were training bombs. Their explosive power was very weak. It was impossible to harm a huge submarine like this. Their goal was to disturb them and force them to climb up, so the ship started. Bombs were dropped on the submarine, and they dropped approximately 5 bombs. But what the Americans did not know was that the submarine crew had lost contact with the command in Moscow for a full week, and no instructions or information had reached them. No one knows whether the reason was negligence on the part of the Soviet leadership, or whether the radio equipment had developed problems. The important thing is that the submarine crew was not in contact with the command, so they were cut off from the outside world for a whole week, and all they knew was that the situation was tense and on the brink of war. When the American ships dropped these weak bombs on them, they thought that they were sitting and attacking them, and they thought that the end of the war had broken out between America and the Soviet Union and even the ships. The Americans were not able to communicate with them because of the depth they were in. These difficult circumstances opened up and communications were cut off. The captain of the submarine decided to fire the nuclear torpedo at the American ships and destroy them. Of course, this thing would kill thousands of American soldiers, and it was almost certain that after that, a comprehensive nuclear war would begin. The son of the submarine was determined to escape. He launched the torpedo, but the captain was not able to take this decision in his heart. In order to activate the launch of the nuclear torpedo, they had to use a special key. Half of this key was with the captain, and the second half was with an officer whom they called the political officer. An officer with a political background can assess the situation better than the captain. A politician is present on board each of the 4 submarines that carry a nuclear torpedo. If the political officer does not agree to launch the torpedo, the captain cannot launch it with his soul. But the captain of the B-59 submarine was able to convince the political officer to give him half of the key he had, which he pressed to make him agree. That's it. Now the captain has 2 key halves, so he is supposed to be able to launch the torpedo and explode the American ships and start World War III. But glory be to God, how the destinies of your Lord decided that this particular submarine, by pure coincidence, would be boarded by the officer whose name is Vasily Arkhipov, whose rank was Chief of Staff in the Soviet Navy, meaning his rank He is higher than the submarine captain, and since he is on board the submarine, he must still agree to launch the torpedo. What happened to Arquibo did not agree to the launch and objected to the captain's decision. He saw that the movements made by these American ships were, yes, annoying and provocative, but they were not hostile enough for him to assume they were in a state of war and they were trying to destroy them. He knew that the American ships could destroy them in moments. If this was their goal, Farrakbov refused. And since his approval was necessary for the launch, the captain could not do anything, and the torpedo was not launched. And in the end, the submarine was forced to rise to the surface, and the American Navy did not even try. They approached the submarine or boarded it, but their faces were to stay away from Cuba. So the submarine returned, and the catastrophe that could have actually led to a third world war was averted. All credit, after God, goes to this officer whose mind was occupied for a little while. And glory be to God how he meant that by chance on board this particular submarine it could have happened. On board any of the 4 submarines, but God chose for him to be on board this submarine whose captain was crazy enough to try to launch the nuclear torpedo without being sure of the situation. Praise be to God, the submarine crisis has been resolved, and the Cuban Missile Crisis will also be resolved immediately afterward on that same day. Kennedy responded to Khrushchev's proposal with a modified proposal. Khrushchev wanted America to withdraw its missiles from Turkey, lift the siege on Cuba, and pledge not to invade it. In return, the Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles and forces from Cuba. A modified approach that Kennedy sent to Khrushchev was that he would implement all of this, but withdraw the missiles from Turkey is not going to happen. Now it is going to happen after 6 months. The goal was to show that withdrawing missiles from Turkey has nothing to do with the agreement. This means that America did not concede. Canadian wanted to protect what America directed in front of its allies in Europe and Turkey. Of course, Artichoke has nothing to guarantee that America will keep its word because it is the one that withdraws its missiles and forces first from Cuba. So it must rely on the fact that Kennedy will keep his word after 6 months and withdraw the American missiles from Turkey. However, when Holt sent the amended proposal, he was afraid that he would not be satisfied with something like this. But Kennedy, after he had it, the second path of his generals and the Soviet Union agreed to the American president's proposal and began withdrawing missiles from Cuba. And the blockade on Cuba was lifted, filled his promise, and withdrew the American missiles from Turkey in a way that appeared as if he had nothing to do with the settlement, because it happened after a while. But most of the countries and parties understood the issue, and Turkey was angry with America and objected to withdrawing the missiles. But America withdrew them in the same way. Of course, in Cuba, Castro was angry with this settlement, and he considered that the Soviet Union and Artichoke sold them to secure their own security, especially since this deal was done completely behind his back. He had no involvement in it, not even consulting with Castro. Perhaps he was the most crazy person on the mind of a nuclear war. But even on the American side, the generals were not happy with the deal, and one of them even described it. Literally, it is the largest defeat in American history. But in any case, thank God, the crisis was resolved, and the period that followed during the era of Kennedy and the Artichokes was a calm period without major problems between the two parties. But Kennedy, of course, would be assassinated a year later, but only during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And most likely it passed through you heard. It has been mentioned before because it is one of the most famous political assassinations in history, and its spirit has stories, theories, films, and the world. Maybe one day I will make a video for you about it if you like. The important thing is that we have reached the end of our story. If you like it, do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button.